Let's start with a number. $58 billion. According to Aon, that was the insured loss just from severe convective storms in the U.S. in 2023. These SCS losses have absolutely spiked. And for all of us in the industry, that kind of volatility, well, it demands that we really get a handle on the statistics we use to turn all this chaos into clear, solid financial decisions.
So, welcome to our Lunch and Learn. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the core statistical concepts that really are the bedrock of modern insurance. And I'm not alone, I've got a fantastic panel here. We have our MGA actuary, who's the one turning all this math into working models.
Hey, glad to be here.
We've also got our lead underwriter from London, who's always asking those tough but crucial so what questions.
Let's make it practical.
And our reinsurance broker, who's the one connecting all these risks to the global capital markets.
It's great to join you all.
Awesome. Okay, let's jump right in.
So here's our game plan. We're going to kick things off with the basics, frequency and severity. Then we'll build on that to understand the average annual loss, AAL. From there, we're going to get into the really interesting stuff, the tail of the risk, talking about return periods, EP curves, and a super important metric, TVAR. And then we'll tie it all together, connecting the dots to the decisions you're making every single day in pricing, underwriting, and reinsurance. All right, let's start at square one. Actuary, can you break down for us the two essential building blocks for looking at any kind of risk? You got it. Everything boils down to frequency and severity. Frequency is pretty straightforward. It's just how often claims happen. So for SCS, we might use something like a Poisson distribution to guess the number of hail days in a county in a given year. Then you have severity. That's how much it costs when a claim does happen, and that usually looks like a right-skewed distribution. What that means is you get tons of small claims, and then this long tail of a few really, really big ones. So we capture frequency with event catalogs and severity with things like our vulnerability curves and policy turns. Okay, so what does that actually mean for my team? For me, the first thing I think about is rate adequacy and attachment points. Is our assumption on frequency right for our basic rate? And are we confident enough in our severity model to set our retentions without getting totally wiped out by one massive hailstorm?
That's exactly it. And from a reinsurance perspective, our clients are using these exact metrics to figure out where their catastrophe program should attach. If you have a poor handle on your severity, you could end up buying a reinsurance program that attaches so high up that it's basically useless.
Okay, so we've got the two basic ingredients, how often and how bad. Actuary, how do we blend those two together to get to that first big benchmark for cat risk? So what we do is we combine them to calculate the average annual loss, or AAL. If you want to get technical, it's the sum of the probability of every single potential loss times the size of that loss run across thousands and thousands of simulated years. Really think of it as the long-run expected loss per year. It's the pure premium you need to have in your pocket just to cover the cost of the risk over the long haul, smoothing out the good years and the really bad ones. And this isn't just theory, right? We see this in the real world every day, especially with SCS. If you have a book of business packed with 15-year-old roofs in a hail-prone part of Texas, your AAL is going to be way, way higher than a book with brand new impact-resistant roofs somewhere less exposed. It becomes a core KPI for us. We're constantly tracking AAL as a percent of total insured value, or TIV, and we benchmark it by territory to see exactly where our risk is piling up. Yeah, and this chart is a great way to see that the AAL isn't just one type of event. It's a composite. It's built from all those frequent, small, attritional losses, the medium-sized events, and those really rare, really expensive catastrophes. Each one is weighted by how likely it is to happen. So when we're pricing a policy, this AAL gets added right into the rate as what we call the catastrophe load. Right, but as we all know, averages are great, but they won't keep the lights on. You can't run a business on averages alone. One bad year can just erase a decade of good work. And that brings us to the tail of the distribution, the extremes. Broker, why don't you introduce us to the idea of return periods and exceedance probability curves? Absolutely. This is really the heart of managing cat risk. The annual exceedance probability, or AEP, is simply the chance that a certain amount of loss will be exceeded in any given year. And the return period, that's just the inverse. So a 1 in 100 year event has a 1% chance of happening or being exceeded in any single year. But, and this is so important for SCS, we have to look at both OEP and AEP. Yeah, let's break that down because it's a really key point. OEP, that's occurrence exceedance probability, looks at the probability of single individual events. Think the single worst storm of the year. But AEP, aggregate exceedance probability, looks at the total losses from all the storms combined in a year. For a peril like SCS, where you can get hit with multiple big outbreaks in a season, that AEP curve often has a much fatter, scarier tail. The story of the season can be much worse than the story of the single worst storm. And that distinction drives our actual strategy. We're looking at that OEP curve to help us decide our per-occurrence retention. How much are we willing to lose from a single event before our reinsurance kicks in? But we're looking at the AEP curve to decide if we need an aggregate reinsurance cover to protect us from one of those years where we just get hammered by a dozen medium-sized storms that never quite trigger our main program.
And something as seemingly small as the hours clause in a policy can completely change whether a multi-day storm is treated as one event or several. And that has massive implications for whose balance sheet, yours or your reinsurer's, ends up paying the claim.
So that 1 in a 100-year number is useful. That gives us our probable maximum loss, or PML, but it's just 1 point on a graph. Actuary, I know there's a more advanced metric that gives us a much fuller picture of what's happening in that tail. Tell us about TVAR.
Right. So value at risk, or VAR, gives you the loss at a specific probability, that 1 in a 100-year data point, but it tells you absolutely nothing about how bad things can get beyond that point. Tail value at risk, or TVAR, asks a much smarter question. It asks, of all the really bad outcomes that are worse than that threshold, what's their average loss? It's calculating the average of the tail, which gives you a much, much better sense of just how severe those extreme outcomes can be.
And this is why it's a game changer for managing capital. TVAR is what we call a coherent risk measure. Now, in plain English, that just means it properly accounts for diversification. VAR, believe it or not, can sometimes fail at that. Because TVAR looks at that entire tail, it rewards a well-diversified portfolio, and it penalizes one that has some hidden, really fat-tailed risks.
And from where I sit, that gap between the AAL and the TVAR is a direct proxy for volatility. We can literally use that gap, the TVAR minus the AL, to help calculate the volatility load we add to our pricing. A riskier book of business with a wider gap demands more capital and, frankly, a higher price.
Okay, so this all sounds great in a model, but the real world is messy, right? It's not enough to just model these things in a vacuum. Let's talk about two of the biggest complexities: correlation and uncertainty. You got it. Correlation is everything. With SCS, you see massive spatial correlation. A single storm outbreak can drop hail across dozens of counties in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, you name it. And you also have correlation between the perils themselves. The same storm can bring both hail and devastating straight-line winds. Our models have to capture this, especially what we call tail dependence. That's the scary tendency for risks to get even more correlated during the worst-case scenarios.
And then you have to layer on the fact that the model itself isn't a crystal ball. There's what we call aleatory uncertainty. That's just the natural randomness of weather. But there's also epistemic uncertainty, which is a fancy way of saying there are gaps in our scientific knowledge. And then there's just plain old data uncertainty. Is the address for this house coded correctly? Do we really know how old that roof is?
So what's the game plan? How do we actually handle all this? For correlation, we set hard caps. We might have a maximum TIV or a maximum marginal TVR that we're willing to put at risk in a single county to stop the losses from piling up. For uncertainty, it's really about being humble. We run our models with multiple different views, we apply secondary uncertainty loads, and we're constantly backtesting. The absolute worst thing you can do is present a single number as the answer. It's always a range. All right, this has been great. Let's bring it all home. Actuary, can you walk us through this table and show us how all these different statistical pieces flow directly into the final price a customer pays?
Sure. It's all right here. You start with your basic non-cat losses. You add your expenses and the profit margin you need. Then you add the pure premium for the catastrophe risk. That's your AAL. On top of that, you add the cost of your reinsurance. And then finally, you add that tail or volatility load, which is directly informed by your TVAR, to make sure you're holding enough capital to survive those extreme years. Every single concept we've talked about today has a line item in this final price.
So when you really boil it all down, it seems like the mandate is pretty clear.
Oh, absolutely. We use these tools to set our risk appetite. We'll make a decision that we can withstand a 1 in 100 AEP event, and we'll report our exposures at different return periods to the board. And we use TVAR to make damn sure we're getting paid for the volatility we're taking on.
And my job is to take that exact risk profile to the market and build the most efficient reinsurance program possible, comparing different options by looking at which one gives us the biggest reduction in TVAR for the cost. So there it is. The final takeaway is this: measure the tail, respect correlation, and always, always communicate uncertainty. That is the statistical foundation for building a resilient and profitable business in what is definitely a stormier world. My huge thanks to the panel.